My fiancé didn't gaslight me alone. That was the part that took me the longest to understand, and once I did, it became the most terrifying thing about him. If it had only been his voice in my ear, maybe I would have trusted myself sooner. If it had only been him telling me I was tired, stressed, overreacting, or reading too much into things, maybe I would have recognized the pattern for what it was. But it wasn't just him. It was my best friend gently telling me to get more sleep. It was my mother asking if wedding stress was making me spiral. It was our premarital counselor suggesting that some women project fear when they feel uncertain about change. It was my brother telling me, with this careful sympathy that almost made me feel ashamed, that maybe I was trying too hard to find a reason not to be happy. By the time I realized what was happening, I wasn't fighting one liar. I was fighting a chorus, and every single voice in it had been arranged for me. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you like stories like this, subscribe now. When I met Owen, he was the kind of man people call calming before they know what it costs to be calm around him. He was not loud, not flashy, not intense in the ways that make women feel flattered and then exhausted. He was measured, polite, thoughtful in a quiet way that made other people lean in. He listened carefully and answered slowly like he respected the weight of words. He never seemed rushed. He never seemed messy. If I was upset, he would soften his voice instead of raising his own. If I was angry, he would lower the temperature in the room so smoothly that I usually came out of the conversation feeling irrational for having entered it hot in the first place. The first year I knew him, I thought that was maturity. I thought I had finally met a man who understood that real strength didn't need to perform itself. What I didn't understand was that some people don't use calm to create safety. They use it to win control without looking aggressive enough to blame. We got engaged after a year and a half, which now sounds fast to me, though at the time it felt reasonable. Owen was 34, I was 31, and the relationship had the polished momentum of something that looked adult from every angle. He had a steady career in brand strategy, a beautiful apartment, a clean history as far as I knew, and a way of making the future sound not just possible but already half-built. He talked about marriage the way some men talk about a promotion, as though it were the natural next step in the orderly life of a person who plans well. That reassured me. I had spent too much time in relationships where every conversation about commitment felt like I was dragging clarity out of a man who preferred vagueness because vagueness let him keep his exits open. Owen was the opposite. He wanted certainty. He liked structure. He said things like, "I don't believe in leaving important things undefined." And at the time, I thought a sentence like that could only come from a good man. The first small fracture appeared around money, which should have interested me earlier because there's almost always a practical motive underneath the emotional manipulation people later romanticize as complexity. I had a trust fund, not some endless, glamorous fortune, but enough to matter. My grandfather had set it up so that I would receive staged access over time, with stronger control passing to me fully once I married or reached a certain age. It was the kind of family arrangement designed by people who believed money protected women best when it moved through legal structure. Owen knew about it before we got engaged, not because I led with it, but because it eventually came up naturally when we talked about future housing and whether I wanted to keep renting or buy. He was gracious about it at first. He said he admired that my grandfather had thought long-term. He said he respected women who understood financial stewardship. He said he would never want me to feel like he loved me for what I had. That last sentence felt noble then. Later, I realized people often deny the thing they most need you not to suspect. About 3 months after the engagement, Owen started talking seriously about consolidating our future. That was his phrase. He used it enough that I can still hear the exact cadence. He said my trust structure was too conservative. He said some of the protections around it made sense if I were single, but not if we were building something together. He said my grandfather had designed it for a different world, and that modern couples needed flexibility. At first, the ideas sounded mild. Reviewing the structure, meeting with someone he trusted, looking at ways to optimize tax efficiency, maybe moving some control into a joint holding account once we were married. He never started with anything large enough to trigger alarm. That was one of his gifts. He knew that if you want a smart woman to accept something bad, you don't begin with the bad thing. You begin with language that flatters her intelligence. I remember the first moment I felt real unease. He had sent me a packet from a financial advisor he wanted us to meet, and buried in the paperwork was a suggested structure that would have shifted more shared access over my assets than he had ever described out loud. Not instantly, not recklessly, but significantly enough that if anything went wrong, unwinding it would be a nightmare. I showed it to him that night while we were making dinner. I expected maybe an explanation, maybe even an apology for not flagging the part I'd obviously care about. Instead, he looked at the page, then at me, and said, in the softest voice, "You're doing that thing again where one line item becomes a catastrophe in your head." That sentence should have stopped me cold, not because it was cruel, but because it carried history that did not belong there. Doing that thing again. As if I had already established a pattern of irrational escalation. I asked what he meant. He smiled, touched my wrist, and said, "Lara, it's paperwork. We haven't agreed to anything. You don't need to brace for danger every time you don't understand something immediately." By the end of the conversation, I wasn't angry anymore. I was embarrassed. That was how he worked. He didn't shut me down through force. He guided me gently into shame. What made his system so effective was that he almost never contradicted me directly at first. He reframed. If I said, "This makes me uncomfortable," he'd say, "I can see that uncertainty is making you anxious." If I said, "You didn't explain this the way it's written," he'd say, "I think your stress is making technical language feel more threatening than it is." If I said, "Why are you pushing so hard on this?" he'd say, "I'm not pushing, I'm planning. You're the one hearing urgency where there isn't any." Those distinctions matter. He didn't call me crazy. He did something much cleaner. He made every reaction I had sound like a symptom of something personal and temporary rather than a response to anything external and real. For a while, it stayed just between us. Then, without me realizing it, it stopped being private. The first other voice was my best friend Tessa. She and I had known each other since grad school, and she had seen me through grief, career changes, one ugly breakup, and enough late-night crying to know the difference between ordinary anxiety and real instinct. That's why her first comment hit me so strangely. We were out for coffee, and I mentioned, carefully, almost apologetically, that Owen had started getting unusually involved in my trust discussions. Tessa frowned, then said, "Can I be honest? I think wedding stress is hitting you harder than you realize." I stared at her because I hadn't said anything about wedding stress. She kept going. She said I seemed exhausted, more watchful lately, like I was always looking for some hidden problem in otherwise good situations. It wasn't a harsh conversation. If anything, it sounded loving. That's why it worked. I left feeling unsettled, but not by Owen anymore, by myself. A few days later, my mother called and asked almost casually whether I was sleeping enough. I asked why. She hesitated, then said Owen had mentioned I'd seemed more activated than usual lately, and that she shouldn't worry, but maybe I needed a few quieter weekends before the wedding. I remember holding the phone away from my ear for a second because something inside me had gone still. I asked what exactly he had said. She answered carefully, as though she didn't want to violate his trust, which makes me sick now to remember. She said he was only concerned that I had a tendency to fixate when I felt out of control. Fixate, that was not my mother's word for me. It was his. After that, the repetition became impossible to ignore and still somehow impossible to name. My brother told me I sounded wound-tight when I raised concerns about the paperwork. Our premarital counselor, Dr. Heller, started steering sessions toward my fear of unpredictability and how people with loss in their history can attach too much danger to healthy dependence. That one landed hard because my father's death had left exactly the kind of emotional scar a good manipulator loves, a fear of being left uninformed until it's too late. Owen knew that. He had held me while I cried about it. He had listened to every story. And now here was a licensed professional, in a calm office with neutral lighting and a box of tissues on the table, suggesting that maybe my concern over money and transparency wasn't really about money or transparency at all. Maybe it was grief, still moving through me sideways. If one person says that to you, you can reject it. If 4 people say it within 2 weeks and each one sounds loving and each one uses slightly different versions of the same idea, something ugly starts happening inside your mind. You stop asking, "What is he doing?" and start asking, "What am I missing about myself?" That shift is where the real damage begins. By then, I wasn't fighting his version of reality directly. I was trying to diagnose whatever defect in me kept making his behavior look suspicious. That is the genius of outsourced gaslighting. It doesn't just make you doubt your perception. It makes you doubt your right to have one. The worst part was how perfectly it fit the season of my life. Brides are expected to be stressed. Women planning weddings are almost stereotyped into emotional unreliability. If you're overwhelmed, everyone assumes it's flowers, seating charts, mothers, money, logistics, hormones, pressure. Owen understood that social camouflage beautifully. He didn't need to convince people I was unstable. He only needed to convince them I was under strain, and then every reaction I had could be folded into that existing cultural script. She's just overwhelmed. She's carrying too much. She'll feel differently when she's rested. None of it sounded malicious. That was the point. There were still moments when the truth nearly broke through. One night I found a folded legal memo in his briefcase summarizing options for shared access rights after marriage. Another time I overheard him on the balcony saying, "She's almost there, she just panics when it feels too final." I walked out before the call ended and asked who he was talking about. He smiled immediately and said, "A client." Then he asked why I looked so pale. I said because I thought he meant me. He laughed softly and stepped toward me like I was adorable for imagining it. "See," he said, "this is what I mean. You're living one heartbeat away from a worst-case scenario all the time." Then he kissed my forehead and led me back inside. That phrase lodged in my body, living one heartbeat away from a worst-case scenario. I heard it again 3 days later when Tessa told me, "You're kind of living one heartbeat away from disaster lately, babe." Same phrase, not similar. The same. I asked where she got that from. She blinked and said, "I don't know, it just came out." But it hadn't just come out, I knew that. My skin knew it before my mind did. I started paying attention, differently after that. Not because I had a dramatic epiphany, because I got tired of feeling haunted by repetition. I went back through texts, old session summaries from Dr. Heller, voice notes from Tessa, and even a couple emails from my brother. And there it was, not perfectly identical, but close enough to make me cold. You always go to the darkest possibility. You sound exhausted. Maybe don't treat every unknown as danger. You need more rest before making big decisions. This isn't the week to spiral. Different people. Same rhythm, same diagnostic tenderness, same structure. It wasn't organic, it was campaign language. The actual proof came by accident, which still infuriates me because it means he almost got away with it through nothing more than consistency and timing. Owen left his laptop open one Saturday morning while he went downstairs to meet a furniture delivery. I wasn't searching for anything. I was trying to send myself a photo from a folder we'd used for apartment inspiration. On his desktop was a notes document titled, "Keep Lara Calm." It should not have been possible for my body to know what was in it before I opened it, but somehow it did. My hands were already shaking when I clicked. Inside was a list. Not a diary, not a letter, a system. Bullet points, names, situations, instructions. Tessa, if she mentions the trust again, remind her she hasn't been sleeping, and that wedding pressure is making her obsess over details. Dr. H, redirect to grief anxiety pattern. Do not let session become about paperwork specifics. Marion, mom. If Lara calls upset, encourage rest and ask if she's eaten. Do not validate legal concerns directly. Jonah, brother. Use humor first. If she escalates, tell her she's trying to find a reason to bolt because things are getting real. Then there was a separate section with notes about me, triggers, soothing phrases, timing, even the order in which people should respond if I raised certain topics. Best if she hears concern from more than one source within same week. If she feels outnumbered too aggressively, back off and reset with affection. Do not argue facts. Name emotion, lower tempo, imply fatigue. I had to sit down on the floor because my knees stopped feeling reliable. I wish I could tell you my first emotion was rage. It was. It was grief so clean it felt like an amputation. Because in one document, every conversation that had made me question myself became understandable. Tessa hadn't spontaneously thought I was spiraling. My mother hadn't independently concluded I was fixating. Dr. Heller hadn't innocently drifted toward grief as the explanation. Owen had briefed them. He had made my life into an atmosphere. He had outsourced his lies into the voices I trusted most, so that even if I resisted him directly, I would still be surrounded by his version of me. Then I found the email thread. He hadn't sent the notes to everyone in exactly the same format, but he had done enough. He sent Tessa messages saying he was scared I was getting lost in catastrophic thinking, and asked if she could help ground me if I reached out. He emailed Dr. Heller ahead of one session, claiming he was worried I was projecting financial trauma and begging for help keeping the conversation emotionally safe. He texted my mother that he didn't want to burden her, but thought I might be more fragile than I appeared, and that he was trying to hold everything together for both of us. Fragile. That word will never feel neutral to me again. And because the universe has a mean sense of timing, while I was still staring at the screen, a new message came in from his financial advisor. Once she signs after the dinner, we should move quickly before anyone starts asking unnecessary questions. That was the sentence that hardened me. Until then, some small part of me had still been asking whether this was manipulation born from fear or control, whether he was trying to win an argument in the ugliest possible way, or whether he was something colder than that. After that sentence, none of it mattered. He was not trying to protect us from my anxiety. He was trying to get me to sign something before the people who loved me understood he had turned them into tools. I didn't confront him. That is the part I am proudest of. The old version of me, the woman he had spent months trying to train, would have cried, demanded answers, perhaps screamed, then spent the next 12 hours being persuaded that the document was contextless, protective, misunderstood, born from concern. No. Once I saw the structure, I understood the only way out was to leave the structure intact long enough to turn it around on him. So I closed the file, took pictures of everything with my phone, sent them to a new email account, and reopened the apartment inspiration folder before he came back upstairs carrying throw pillows and an expression of easy domestic normalcy. For the next 10 days, I played along so well it almost frightened me. I softened. I slept more. I stopped bringing up paperwork. I told Tessa I was trying to get ahead of my stress. I told Dr. Heller she might be right that my father's death was coloring more things than I realized. I told my mother I had probably been more anxious than I admitted. Every person in Owen's carefully arranged chorus relaxed a little more each time I echoed his narrative back to them. He loved it. I watched him become sweeter, warmer, more openly relieved. He started touching my back more when we moved through a room together. He suggested a small family dinner the following Friday so we could reset the emotional weather before finalizing a few wedding and finance decisions. That phrase was so polished, I almost admired the shamelessness of it. He thought he was gathering his witnesses. He had no idea I was gathering mine. I didn't just want proof that he lied. I wanted the people he used to understand how. That mattered to me more than exposure alone. If I had simply dumped screenshots into a group chat or called off the engagement with one dramatic speech, he still would have had room to work on the others later, to explain, to soften, to reinterpret. Men like Owen live in the gap between event and understanding. I wanted no gap. So I called each person separately. Not with accusation, with invitation. I told Tessa I needed her there, because I was finally ready to be more honest about how overwhelmed I'd been. I told my mother I wanted a calm dinner and no drama. I told my brother I needed his humor in the room because things had felt too serious. I called Dr. Heller and said I thought it might be useful to have one final informal conversation before we continued sessions after the wedding. He hesitated, then agreed because he believed, as they all did, that he was helping stabilize a sensitive woman before an important transition. Not one of them knew they were walking into the collapse of their own role in his script. The dinner took place in our apartment. Candlelight, polished table, good wine, the kind of warm domestic setting Owen always knew how to use as a shield. He opened the door smiling. He kissed my mother's cheek. He thanked Tessa for coming. He told my brother he appreciated the backup. He made a little joke to Dr. Heller about how he hoped no one would start billing by the hour. Everyone laughed. Of course they did. For the first 20 minutes, it felt exactly like what he wanted it to feel like. A room built around his steadiness. Then he began. That is something I will never forget. He actually began the intervention himself because he thought the room was still his. He set down his glass and said, very gently, "Before we get too far into dinner, I think it might help if we all talk honestly about how hard the last few weeks have been for Lara." My mother stiffened. Tessa looked concerned. My brother glanced at me with that careful look people use when they think they are helping by taking fragility seriously. Owen went on. He said wedding pressure affects people differently, that I had been carrying a lot, and that maybe hearing from the people who loved me would help me feel less alone and less afraid. He used the word afraid 3 times in under a minute. And I let him finish. Then I stood up, walked to the sideboard, and brought back 7 envelopes. I handed one to each person at the table, including him. No one understood yet. They were still reading the moment the old way. A difficult conversation, a loving correction, a worried bride. Then I said, "Before anyone tells me how I've been feeling, I want each of you to read what Owen told you to say first." That was the exact sentence. My mother opened her envelope first. Tessa second. Dr. Heller went pale almost immediately, which I noticed before anyone else because I was watching him closely. Inside each envelope were printed screenshots of Owen's messages to that specific person, plus copies of the notes document where he assigned them roles in managing me. I didn't speak while they read. I wanted the room to change by itself. Tessa whispered, "Oh my God." My mother didn't say anything at all. She just looked up at Owen, and the disappointment in her face was so complete it almost looked calm. My brother read his page twice, then said, "What the hell is this?" Dr. Heller set his papers down very carefully and asked Owen, in a tone colder than I had ever heard from him, whether he had withheld material context from multiple counseling sessions while simultaneously instructing third parties to frame my concerns as emotional instability. It was one of those sentences that sounds almost clinical until you realize what it means in human language. You turned people into tools. Owen tried to recover quickly. He said it looked worse than it was. He said he had only been worried about me. He said he was trying to protect me from making impulsive decisions while overwhelmed. He said the notes were private coping strategies, not manipulation. Then I placed one final packet in the center of the table. The email from his advisor about getting my signature before anyone asked unnecessary questions, along with the draft structure for my trust access and the advisor's summary of how quickly funds could be moved once the paperwork cleared. That was the moment his explanation died. Because suddenly, the emotional management had a motive attached to it. It wasn't abstract concern. It wasn't premarital stress. It was strategy. He had not been building a supportive environment around a stressed fiancé. He had been manufacturing a psychological climate in which my resistance to his financial plan would look like instability instead of intelligence. Tessa started crying. Not for me first, though eventually for me too. For herself. Because she realized she had been used against someone she loved and had done it in the voice of care. My mother stayed silent for a long time, then said, very quietly, "You wanted us to be your credibility." That sentence landed harder than anything I could have said. My brother shoved his chair back from the table like the room had become physically dirty. Dr. Heller apologized to me in a voice that sounded like it hurt him to use it. And Owen, for the first time since I had known him, lost his calm. He didn't scream. That would have at least been honest. He got sharper, faster, more contemptuous. He said everyone was overreacting. He said I had violated his privacy. He said supportive partners are allowed to ask for help when they're worried. He said none of them understood how impossible I had become lately. That was the moment I laughed because there it was. Once he lost access to the soft mask, all he had left was the same old accusation stripped of elegance. Difficult woman. Impossible woman. See how hard I've had it. Then I said the line I had been waiting to say for 10 days. "You didn't gaslight me. You franchised it." No one spoke after that for a second. Then my brother actually laughed, once, in disbelief so sharp it cut the air. Tessa covered her mouth. My mother closed her eyes briefly. Even Owen seemed stunned, which I think is because he had spent so long managing my reactions that he forgot I still had my own language. I ended the engagement at that table. Not privately later, not after another conversation, right there. I told him the wedding was over. I told him he would never get another conversation with me alone. I told him any further communication would go through my attorney. Then I told him to leave the apartment. He actually blinked and asked where he was supposed to go, as if he still thought practical confusion might soften me. I said, "That sounds stressful. Maybe ask someone to help you stay calm." My mother laughed then. A real laugh, brief and shocked and almost unwilling. It was the only funny moment in the entire nightmare. The practical aftermath was brutal in the way all real endings are brutal. Vendors, deposits, calls, messages, his attempts to frame what happened as a mutual breakdown under wedding pressure. But the one thing he could never recover was the chorus. That was the genius of the ending, and I knew it even while the logistics were still making me sick. The people he had used to destabilize me no longer belonged to him. Tessa cut him off completely and spent months apologizing without ever making her guilt my burden. Dr. Heller documented what he could and terminated any future professional involvement in writing. My mother stopped asking whether I had eaten and started asking whether I wanted company. Even my brother, who had always defaulted to calm down and don't spiral, looked at me differently after that. Not like I was fragile, but like he finally understood how much effort it takes to make a sane woman doubt her own mind. And that was the reward. Not just that I left, not just that I caught him, not just that he lost the wedding, the access, and the version of me he thought he could shape. The real reward was that he lost the borrowed voices. He lost the comfort of hearing his own lie returned to me through people I loved. He lost the social machinery he had built around my confusion. For a man like Owen, that was the deepest possible injury, because his real talent had never been deception alone. It had been orchestration. A month later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that he had described the breakup as a communications collapse. That phrase made me smile for the first time in weeks. A communications collapse, as if the problem had been messiness, overlap, crossed wires. Not a man building a human echo chamber around his fiancé so she would sign away more control than she understood. Men like him never truly confess. They rename. The strangest part of recovery was how much quieter my mind became once I was no longer hearing his language through other people. That was when I understood the full violence of what he had done. He had not just lied to me. He had tried to colonize interpretation itself. He wanted the world around me to become a system that turned every alarm inside me into evidence against me. And the reason that matters so much is because once a person succeeds at that, you stop needing to be watched. You start watching yourself on their behalf. That is what I was escaping more than the wedding, more than the money, more than him. I was escaping the version of my own mind he was trying to install permanently. If you are listening to this and thinking, that sounds extreme, let me tell you something I wish someone had told me sooner. When several people around you start using the same language to reinterpret your reality, pay attention. Especially if the language always makes you smaller. Especially if it turns your questions into symptoms. Especially if the person most invested in that interpretation benefits from your confusion. Concern can be real. Care can be real. But when concern keeps arriving in coordinated phrases that all lead you away from the same uncomfortable facts, that isn't support. That's management. I did not lose my mind. I was outnumbered inside it for a while. And once I understood that, the shame disappeared. Anger stayed. Grief stayed. But shame left because shame only survives while you still think you failed a test you were supposed to pass. I was never meant to pass his test. I was meant to surrender to it. He just didn't expect me to read the answer key before he got my signature. If you want more stories like this, don't forget, subscribe now. There's a lot more coming. And before you leave, I've got another story for you right here. It's about a fiancé who spent months making a woman doubt her own instincts, until one night she saw the group chat that explained everything. Click that one next, because it gets ugly fast.